Well, good morning. Welcome to another episode of Papa's Workshop. These are for Adam, Brady, Luke, and Brenna. And today we have a birthday. Actually, we have two birthdays today. Adam and Luke's mom and Brady and Brenna's Uncle Dave both turned 29 on today. Well, maybe not. I can't really say how many years ago they turned 29, but sometime they turned 29 on this day of the year. Before we get started, let's check in with our assistant. There's my Molly. Yes, she's a good girl. Just sitting there doing her job. Here, you want a treat? There you go, girl. She works pretty cheap, just for a little bit of treats. She's good. All right, let's get to work. Okay, today we're about out of tools to talk about, so we're going to start on to some projects. I've got three projects that are relatively simple coming up, but I don't quite have all of what I need yet. So today we're just going to talk briefly about wood. I mean, that's what we're making, right? Making stuff out of wood. So you got to know a little bit about wood, and I've covered some of that through our other talks. If you remember, let's talk about the tree. So if this is a tree, and this is the center of it, that center portion is called the pith. P-I-T-H. And that's not very good. You want to avoid that. And a lot of times, quality lumber mills will actually cut that and cut around that, and that'll be scrap. The next is there's a ring. It's usually darker, but not always. That's the heartwood, and then of course you've got the bark around the outside, and then this is the sapwood in the middle. That's the heartwood. It depends on the species, the type of tree, of how big that heartwood is. Sometimes it's no bigger than that. Other times it's out here and there's not very much sapwood. It all depends. And why that's important, or why I'm bringing that up, is let's see if we got a piece here. Here's a piece of cherry. And if you can see on the end there, this lighter wood on the end, that's the sapwood. And so it comes out white. It's a different color. Same way for walnut. That's a lighter sapwood color, and the darker part is the heartwood. You don't see a lot of difference in the pines, but these hardwoods, there is a difference. So you kind of need to know that. And what some milling companies or logging companies will do with the walnut. So this is the walnut. It's a dark wood. It's not normally blue. Well, what they'll do is in the drying process, they'll steam it, and that'll turn that sapwood darker, and it gives it a more uniform look. It also, I think, kind of dulls the regular part of the walnut, the heartwood of the walnut. So if you can get it, I prefer the air dried walnut. To me, it's got a little bit richer color to it, but. So that's kind of how the log is. Now the way they cut it into lumber makes a difference. So you've got the rings going this way, right? The growth rings each year that produces another ring, and you can see that just in the end of the board. See the rings? So if they just cut them like this is flat sawn. Some of the lower grade lumber they'll cut just like that. Some of the higher grade stuff, they'll take that center pith and throw that part away. So that's flat sawn. Then there's the tree, and they'll cut it into fourths or into quarters, and then they will cut the lumber this way. That's more expensive, but so each board's got the rings going like this. And the reason that's sought after is that it's very stable. It doesn't change as much. Let me get to the... So you got a board. The board doesn't change much in this direction, the length. It changes in moisture. So for construction lumber, 2x4s and stuff like that, they dry at the factory or at the lumber yard to about 16 to 20%, usually closer to 20%. It's pretty wet. Hardwoods that you get for furniture are going to be more like in the 10 to 12% or water content. And if you go from 20 to 10%, this doesn't change much in this direction. But this way and this way do change. And how much depends on the species of wood, but also how it's cut. A quarter sawn, where the rings are going like this, it doesn't change near as much in this direction as, say, we got another piece that's flat sawn, and the rings are going like this. This one will change more than this one. And of course, the thickness, that changes, and it changes depending on, since this face is kind of a quarter sawn at the end, this doesn't change as much as this. And what actually happens is that those can actually dry exaggerated. It kind of dries like that. Is it this way? I forget. Anyway, there's a slight difference in as it dries that way. So the quarter sawn also gives you kind of straight lines on the and the flat sawn. If we get another one down here. So the flat sawn we got like this. You'll actually get as each of those rings hit the surface. So you can kind of tell by looking at it whether it's quarter sawn or flat sawn. And like I said, the quarter sawn's more stable, but it doesn't have as much figure to it. Of course, in the real world, you get a little bit of both on boards. Let's see if we can't really see that one. That's a piece of red oak. You can see it's red, and that's probably the sapwood out here. This darker color, but you can kind of see the rings. You got some that's almost going that way at the ends, but so it's kind of a mix of how it's going to dry. And then we showed you the cherry. And see, almost the pith would be up here somewhere. Here's a piece of maple, but it's hard to really see. It's so light. It's heavier. The hard maple is just like the name says. It's hard. You can get hard and soft maple, but they're white wood and pretty smooth. Whereas the walnut and the red oak or have a rougher texture to them because of their large cells on the wood. Here's a piece of birch, and again we've got the darker heartwood and a lighter sapwood on there. But since this is a light board, it doesn't have a lot of difference. This is good. It's a closed grain cells on the wood, so it's good for paint. If you're going to paint something, this is good to be as a base for that. A lot of kitchen cabinets that are painted are birch. Let's see. So we got a piece of this is maple too, but this is quilted or curly maple. I don't know if you can see the reflections as you turn it. You kind of see those rays. And so if you stain this, that becomes very pronounced, those streaks. The same with a cherry. You can get the curly cherry, and it's kind of like that. My assistant thinks there's a thunderstorm coming, so she may bark some more. Here's some purple heart, and you see it's purple. It does get a little bit lighter with age, and it's a pretty heavy, hard wood's hard on your tools. Of course, we've seen the pine. You've got different grades of lumber, right? Because this has got a knot in it. You've got what they call first and seconds, which is first has the amount of knots that it's allowed to have. Seconds is a little worse, and then you get select, which is down, and then you get common, and there's 3-4 different versions of common, and they have even more knots per board and the width of the board. So all sorts of grades for that. Here's a piece of this is poplar. You see it's kind of green. That green will turn to a brownish, coffee brown as it ages, and it's very common to see that green in it along with the white. Mostly they're white. I think the green must be the sapwood, because you usually don't see as much of it. Maybe I got that backwards, but it's I use this a lot for drawers. It's a soft wood, but it's a little harder than pine, and it's much easier to work with. It's usually pretty straight grained, not a lot of knots, and it works well, but it's not as strong, obviously, as a hardwood would be. Here's a piece of mahogany. That's a little more expensive. Actually, the best mahogany is supposed to be Cuban mahogany, which you can't really get anymore. That's what all the furniture in the 1700s was made out of. The finest furniture was made out of Cuban mahogany. But they pretty much, almost all overforested that area, and so the Cuban government doesn't allow that anymore. But there are a lot of names, a lot of different kinds of mahogany. This is Philippine mahogany, and you can see it's a very different. And this one is much lighter, even though it's a lot thicker. So you don't want the Philippine mahogany. Let's see. And you've got. So this is a piece of white oak, and you can see it's the difference in color. They have about the same texture, and so does ash. I got a piece of ash here somewhere. I don't have. Ash looks pretty much the same as the white oak does. The same kind of rough texture. Then you got your man-made stuff. You got plywood. This is a piece of birch plywood, and you see and this is a fairly high grade of birch plywood. It's got thin layers, and what voids there are filled. so there shouldn't be any air pockets in it, and no knots on the surface. Whereas, so that was a piece of 3/4 inch. Here's a 1/2 inch piece, but you see it's got big knots in it. So it's got one face of it that's graded higher than the other side. And see, the layers are much thicker on that, because it's a lower grade plywood. And you will get air pockets. This particular pieces, but you'll get big voids in some of the lower grade products. And you can get exterior grade, which you don't really use for making furniture, but it just has waterproof glue on it. And then you got your, let's see, what did I do with that piece of, I had a piece here somewhere. Oh, here it is, buried underneath there is MDF. MDF is basically sawdust and glue, fine sawdust, whereas particle boards, bigger chunks of wood, which I don't use at all. This stuff is good for fixtures and stuff because it's flat. It's dead flat. It doesn't really warp. It's pretty stable as far as the changes in humidity, and it's really smooth. And but it doesn't have a lot of strength. It doesn't have a grain, so in any direction it can be break, and it doesn't really hold screws very well because it just kind of crumbles. But it is good for fixtures. If you need something, that's a good base for. If you get a veneer, veneer. First, I didn't even bring out any veneer. Veneer is just really thin. This isn't really veneer, but you get the idea. It's really thin strips of wood, and you can glue it to a piece of MDF. And you want to glue both sides so that it's stable, so the glue doesn't try to scrunch up one side. But anyway, so that's really good. In fact, you can get plywood with different coatings on it. Like this right here is a piece of cherry. Well, it's a piece of cherry plywood. This particular one has, you can see, pretty thick layers, but those two outside brown layers are not the cherry. That's MDF. There's 1/8 of an inch or so. They're a little bit less than that, maybe 3/16 of MDF, and then a really thin layer of cherry on top of that. So this makes good stable panels. If you need a side of a bookcase or something like this is really strong and stable, and it has the same cherry, and you can get it in walnut or anything you want. You can get in the plywood. Sometimes you can even get one side of cherry and one side of birch or whatever. They can have two different purposes. And then you got hardboard. Sometimes it's called Masonite. Masonite's the brand name or company that makes it. And sometimes one side will be rough and one side is smooth. But this is really hard, really dense. Harder than the MDF, and actually you can get different grades of the MDF of hardness and weight. The harder, the heavier. So this again is good for fixtures and that. The plywood I use a lot, for if it's not a reproduction, I use for drawer bottoms or the back of a cabinet. That'll all stay pretty stable. I'll use some of this veneered stuff if I'm doing like a tabletop, and it's going to have a hardwood edge, so I can put a strip of wood on the edge and go all the way around with it to cover up the lines. So that makes a stable top. You can also get other wood products. You can get molding. You know, that's just all sorts of shapes and sizes of that pre-made, and it usually you can get it in oak. Some places you can get it in cherry. You could have to go to a really specialty store to get it in any kind of other. Usually it's ready for painting. You know, some of it is in MDF. It's ready for painting, that kind of a thing. So not really for furniture. I think that's about it. Let me see here. Check the scorecard. Pine comes in all covers, that word pine covers a lot of different species of pine. And yellow pine is actually is more pronounced growth rings in it, and the dark part of it's really much harder than the white part of the ring. So you try to work it. It's kind of almost a saw effect when you're doing it, because you run into hardwood and then softwood, hardwood, and it actually ends up, as it ages, it gets pretty hard. So it's a good construction. Yellow pine is, but then you can get like aspen. Aspen's really kind of a soft. It's white wood. It's sometimes sold as pine. You get the really light stuff like basswood and balsa wood, really super light and soft. Basswood's used for carving a lot, figures and that kind of a thing. I'll use it as I don't have one here with me. If I'm doing a trial carving of a leg or something, I will use a basswood blank first, just because it's easy to carve. So I said there's hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of woods. What I've kind of been here is what you can get easily, which, you know, basically in North America. But you get a lot of the exotics from South America or Asia or Africa, and some of those are pretty oily or heavy. I mean, they're expensive too. So I don't work with those much, but I think that about does it. Hopefully the birthday pair are enjoying their birthday today, and we will hopefully be able to start some sort of a project next week, and we'll go from there. Go Chiefs!